So, like I said, Thrasymachus offers this radical challenge to justice or morality and, you know, just whatever's in the interest of whoever's in charge, whoever is quote unquote stronger in society. And as I said, I don't think that Thrasymachus is silly here. And I do think there's some evidence that what he says is true. That does not necessarily mean he is right, though. And Socrates presents some pretty powerful challenges to Thrasymachus. Now, I think part of the problem here, part of the reason people are often a lot of people are very convinced by Thrasymachus. Part of that I think just is, well, he's a bad boy, right? This seems cool, you know, the radical, crazy, whatever view, that is the one that people like, or at least find interesting. I think then that's part of what's going on here. But I also think another thing that is going on here is that Thrasymachus's views are clear. Socrates' response is, I think, a good one, but it's a little hard to follow. I mean, actually, I think Socrates has a couple lines of response, but they're a little hard to follow given the way he puts them. So I'm going to put these in rather different words than Socrates uses, but I do think it gets at, the basic ideas he's trying to get across. And so the first part of Socrates' response is this: what if those in charge are wrong about what's in their interests? You say the people in charge will set the rules of justice and they'll set them to benefit themselves. And so when we do what's just, we benefit the stronger at our own expense, right? Obviously, we shouldn't want to do that. We're letting ourselves be exploited if this is true, so we should act unjustly when we can, right? But Socrates challenges this. He says, well, look, what about cases where people in charge think that one thing is in their interests? Let's take your theory, Thrasymachus, and run with it, right? But what if those people are wrong and they actually set moral rules or rules of justice that are bad for them? He doesn't give us cases, but again, I think you can find cases from our own history or more recent history rather easily, right? And one really blatant one is the Nazis' persecution of Jewish scientists, right? All these things are always more complicated, but it's not inaccurate to give the short answer of, well, why did the US successfully build an atomic bomb and the Germans not? The short answer is like, well, they ran off all their best scientists and they all came here or Britain. Might be a little simple, but it's also not wrong, right? Einstein was German. Most of the scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project, maybe not, I don't know, maybe not most by count, but most of the most important ones were German or were otherwise refugees from the Nazis, right? Yeah. Well, if you are the Nazis and you're trying to take over the world, it's not in your interest to run off your best scientists who then help the people you're fighting build a doomsday weapon, right? Persecuting your best scientists, if you are a maniacal dictator who wants to rule the world, not good for what you want to do, right? And I know, people argue, well, who are you to say what's in the Nazis' best interest? Maybe they wanted to murder or harass this group of people even more than they wanted to do whatever else. And my response would just be, look, if what you do ends up with your neck in a noose, or you buried in a bunker with the Russians about to pull you out and you kill yourself so the Russians basically don't do horrible things they want to do to you as Hitler did, what you've done is not in your interest, right? And it's not just that they persecuted Jewish scientists, their own bias led them to denigrate like physics Even Werner Heisenberg, who stayed behind and wasn't Jewish, he was the best physicist who didn't leave. And they gave him a hard time because they said, oh, Heisenberg, your physics is Jewish, right? Just bonkers stuff, right? The Nazis persecuting Jews was not in the interests of them winning the war. Just wasn't, right? Not even just the scientists, a lot of their most talented, prominent citizens were Jewish and they lost them, right? The Nazis racism was vile in and of itself, but it's also not in their interest if they want to be the people who take over the world, right? They are wrong about what's in their best interest. And in order to take a more subtle, but I think also revealing case from our own history, you can think of the Jim Crow segregation system in the South after the Civil War, right? This is a system where African Americans are horribly discriminated against. But you might think, you might get this simplistic picture of, well, it's just, here are white people putting in a system that benefits them and hurts other people, benefits them at the expense, right? But economists have actually done a lot of study, and that's not what was happening at all. Or at least it's not how it actually worked out. This might have been what the people were trying to do, but it's not what happened, right? After the Civil War, the South was by far the most poor and backwards part of the US. Even the rich people in the South were poorer than the rich people up north. And economists like this one guy, Wright, who wrote this really good book, Sharing the Prize, have proven that this system of segregation and discrimination had a lot to do with it, right? You do not develop the talents of a certain part of your population, that's bad for your economy. A huge part of your population can't use your businesses comfortably. Well, if you're a businessman, that's terrible for you too, right? Northern businesses like Sears and mail order catalogs got all these businesses from African Americans because they weren't comfortable with the businesses at home, right? And when Lyndon Johnson passed like the Civil Rights Bill and started to undermine this Jim Crow system, the South actually started to do economically way, way better. There's just you can just date it from this point. This system of segregation wasn't good for anybody. The people in charge could have been better off if they hadn't imposed such a horrible, unfair system. It wasn't even good for them, right? The rich people, the powerful people in the South at this time were poorer and less powerful and generally well off than their counterparts in the North, right? No big important business in the 1960s or 50s was headquartered in the South. Kodak wasn't, IBM wasn't, Ford wasn't, Chevrolet wasn't, none of them, right? Guys like Wright have argued, well, it's because of this system. It wasn't good for anybody. Even the people in charge are wrong about what's in their interests. There's a sociologist I like, John Shelton Reed, who kind of tongue-in-cheek said, this was in the 70s, that, people in Atlanta are too greedy to hate. He has tongue in cheek, but, Wright had a point. Rational self-interest, greed would tell you that a certain kind of bigotry and unjust treatment just isn't in your interest, right? This is what Socrates has in mind. And we will come back to this because these cases, there's a lot more going on here than it might seem, and they really are kind of the thin edge that he uses to crack Thrasymachus's case. But the first thing he does is present a dilemma. And I think this is worth talking about, even though it's not the strongest, part of Socrates' case. It's not weak, but the other part is even more powerful. He says, well, look, you, Thrasymachus, can admit that the people in charge might be wrong about what's in their best interests. I just gave you guys a couple cases from history more recently, not from ancient Greek history, but this obviously happens, right? And when this happens, your theory of justice seems to lead to a contradiction, or it seems to give two wildly different answers. So, what is just? Is just following the rules actually set by those in charge? Well, but then it also seems unjust because if the rules are actually not in their interest, by being just, you're harming them. So you're actually being unjust in a sense. Or is justice what's really in the interest of those in charge? Well, yeah, then you're breaking the law, and breaking the law is just because they don't know what's really in their own interests, and you do. So you're being just by actually benefiting them, but that's breaking the law. How is that just? You, Thrasymachus, seem to have this contradiction. That's a big problem. And now look, this might not seem terribly convincing to you guys. You might say, well, that's clever, Socrates. It's a little hair splitty. But I think there's something way, way deeper and more damaging for Thrasymachus going on here, and this is what we'll talk about in the next lecture.